circumvent the lack of card draw, of course, is, well, if your minions stick on board for longer, not drawing cards is a benefit, which we see with the Kulturan Chaplain here. So let's see how it goes as we dive straight into the mirror. And I do wonder if, for example, in the mirror, you could argue is a little bit better, because if you're paying 3 mana to play a 1/3 in the mirror, even with the card draw in a lot of instances, that's just not good enough. How do you like Leta's hand here, Sottle? I think just the Voracious Reader could go, honestly. Void Touched and Kulturan in the Raised Dead pool looks like a pretty good 2 of Raised Dead to me.
Yeah, the question is, what's the curve, right? Because that 3 keep that you're suggesting, Void Touch, Twilight Deceptor, Kulturan, almost feels like more of an on-the-play curve to me. Wow, it actually goes full. I wasn't expecting that much of a diversion, but I do feel like the curve didn't quite work out with that as a 3 keep, but I am a little bit surprised to see all of the options thrown away in that spot.
All right, got a Void Touch back. Again, of course, the weird thing about Void Touched in this is you need to be ahead, because there's a reason your opponent also plays a Void Touched, is they also benefit from having wide minions and dealing tons of damage. So it's still just a good minion, 1 mana 1/3 that you can obviously Divine Shield and buff, as long as you can keep hold of the board, because there's a lot of instances in this mirror match where if you're slightly ahead or even on board and you get to make trades, a lot of the time you will trade away everything but the opponent's Void Touch to then just pressure even more damage going forward.
See the benefit of the more aggressive mulligan from Leta. I imagine on coin he was going a little bit more aggressively for gambling stuff, maybe, just because that can come down so much quicker in the when you are on the coin. The gambling, 0 costs and Raised Dead kind of hand where you can just do absolutely insane things in the scenario. But he has ended up with a fairly similar hand to what he had before. It's just a little bit more aggressive. And honestly, I think the hand that he ended up with does play a little bit better with the coin than the hand that he perhaps could have kept in this position. But the Frazzle Freshman on the other side is just such a terror at this point. For Leta to deal with, just because of that massive health pool. One of the very few minions that can come down in the early game that does not get countered by Tour Guide.
Actually, although it's a tricky hand to play out, I actually like 1/1 hero power here from Bozzzton. Oh. Okay, he isn't doing what I thought he was going to do. I thought he was actually going to commit to killing the Void Touch, but he's going to isolate the Void Touch here and say this will be enough, even though the Void Touch gets a guaranteed trade. Makes it reasonably likely that you can land a Wriggling Horror this turn, because again, it's unlikely that Leta will just hero power something, and if he does without a Tour Guide of his own, that's the whole turn done and dusted, which is a victory for Bozzzton, honestly.
What is Elun's will?
Yeah, no, this could be a double 1-drop play from Leta, and he can do the same thing, but isolate the 1/4.
Yeah, just wondering again whether the ping goes on the 1/4 yet again, killing the other 2 minions with the Org Merchant and the 1/3 trade. It's such an aggressive fight for board control in this matchup. We've seen examples of this throughout Hearthstone, right? The 2 most aggressive decks in the format clashing with each other to the point where neither of them get to be aggressive at all. Yeah, exactly. In the end, he chooses to hold on to the ping, which I think is the other reasonable option here as well. Can still allocate that to the 1/4 on the following turn. This gives him the option of pinging something else on the following turn. The option it takes away, however, is pinging the 1/4 for 0 this turn and then pinging something else for 2 next turn. Or if you get Raised Dead, pinging something else for 0 again next turn, right, with the Revived Tour Guide. So there are sacrifices to doing it this way, but it does increase flexibility on average, I would say.
These Tour Guides are just so big in the matchup. Normally, Tour Guide is just fine to decent, but in this matchup, when you are aggressively fighting for board, 0 mana hero power makes so much difference. You could play like just 2 whole extra minions because of this. Or 1 Wriggly one. I actually really like it. A 2-5 feels immortal in most instances in this matchup. So I really like the wriggling here. Can ping away the 2-1.
Yep. Looks solid.
And it's slowly slipping away here for Leta. But Ray's dead. That's a good one. That at least gives him resources to try and even up on board.
But this is the slight punish for the situation I was talking about last turn, right? Where he... Obviously, the tour guide isn't dead, but if he'd have pinged on the previous turn, he would have had the option to trade in the tour guide, go for the Raise Dead to hit the tour guide. Ping again this turn. He could have, for example, done 4 damage to that Frazzled Freshman instead of what he's ended up doing here. Kind of interesting. Interesting to look at. Obviously... On average, as I said, he got more flexibility by doing it the way he did, but there are so many cards that equal Raise Dead in your deck that I think it's always something that's worth thinking about in the long run.
It's kind of tough though, right? Because if he drew the Decepticon, then he would have had to have gone face.
He wouldn't have had the source of damage,
guide,
yeah,
right?
that's true.
Or something, so that would have been a little bit tricky. Maybe the fact that he needed exactly Raise Dead was the deciding factor. But yeah, I do agree. It's really
but you also don't know before the fact that the opponent isn't going to kill your tour guide on that turn, right?
That's
so for all you know, you might go into the next turn with the tour guide already dead.
Turns out the game's pretty hard.
Yeah.
Oof. How is that turn there from Leta?
Always an interesting dynamic in Hearthstone casting because, you know, sometimes we'll go down the rabbit hole like that, and we could do that all day for all play. You just discuss one play for 20 minutes, ignore everything else, but I don't think that would make a particularly engaging broadcast.
It would for like 3 people, and 2 of them would be me and you.
Yeah, true.
Okay, so straight off the top here, Bozzzton can go Frazzled Freshman, Void Touched, Traveling Merchant. He does forgo the ping, but he gains a ton of board presence and a reasonably beefy Merchant.
We talked about this yesterday, but when did you start using the word forgo?
I've always said it.
Have you?
You only pick up on the stuff I say that you don't like the sound of. Everything else goes under the radar.
So only, what, 90% of your speech then? Okay.
Yeah. The gold mine if you really listen. You could learn a thing or two.
Okay. And what already feels like the 93rd Frazzled Freshman of the game. But Bozzzton has reached the point now, I think, where he is massively dominant on the board. Big Patches has been drawn from Leta, and I think, yeah, it's about the best option that he has in this position, but this is now just so much damage coming back the other way. This has to be an L for Leta from this position.
Yeah, you look at small silver linings of, well, at least Big Patches has 6 health, which is actually a lot in this matchup. Very hard to take down efficiently, but it's just not as good as what Bozzzton has right now. Wide minions, he has the Void Touched, has Wriggling. He can play all this turn to make a huge Merchant, push a ton of damage, and a lot of the time you have to look at, can you play Void Touched in the mirror? Because the backswing from your opponent might be too strong. Simply not the case in this instance. So a very safe Void Touch from Bozzzton. Extremely confident here. Going to trade off it, trade off that one at the end of the turn and feel very safe. And
if you want a very basic introductory lesson on when can you and can't you play Void Touched in the mirror, count the minions, right? Like if you have more, then it's probably beneficial for you to have Void Touched on the board. Obviously there are exceptions to that. We saw one of those exceptions from Casey yesterday, whereas if it's just lethal, if you play, sorry, not yesterday, last week, whereas if it's just lethal, then don't play it in that position. But yeah, Bozzzton was...
literally lose.
Bozzzton was so dominant in that position because he had 5 or 6 minions in play, and there was just one 5/6 on the other side of the board. So the Void Touch was adding 1 damage for the opponent, and, you know, upwards of 6 or 7 for Bozzzton in that position. But that's generally what the matchup is about. It's that battle for wide board. It's very old school Zoo in that regard, whereas as long as you get 1 or 2 minions ahead of your opponent, you have so much more flexibility in terms of when and where to land your buffs to create the good trades against your opponent or create the good face attacks against your opponent, and that's what we saw in the end there from Bozzzton.
And he is going to be moving on to his Handlock, going up against this Priest once again. And again, this is the, if you're playing Giants, this is close enough to like the Handlock. There are some players who cut the Tams in and actually play the 2 gold Shire Knolls, but that's like the biggest difference generally out of this list. And it's a list I really like. It's a list I've been playing all morning, a bit last night as well, going back to some Handlock. But it is one that can struggle versus Priest, because outside of drawing exactly spot removal or Soul Rend, that's close to all the deck's got, because by the time you play or can play a reasonably costed Giant, you're often staring down death on the Priest side.
I think this is one of the matchups that we didn't give enough credit to early on. One of the things I did start to hear more and more from top players as they actually put some time into Shadow Priest and got better at the deck was that, for example, in some of the last Hero Standing weeks, I heard players say that they were very, very happy queuing Shadow Priest into like Greedy Handlock, Threats Handlock, and Netheron Flesh Giant Handlock as it was back then. Whereas I think, you know, on broadcast, we've kind of been portraying the matchups a little bit closer than that because, you know, Soul Rend is so particularly backbreaking. But once the Divine Shields start to come into play, and even some of the health pool manipulation can get out of range of Soul Rend, and then even Raised Dead coming down just to refill boards afterwards, I think the best Priest players were feeling very, very comfortable against Handlocks in general, as long as it's not the super, super slimmed down, infinite removal Armor Vendor Moarg list that, for example, a Falcane has bringing to this week, which I think has a much better chance against Priest overall.
And this is the problem as well, right? Yes, you heal off the quest, but Bozzzton going to go for Cult Neophyte instead of tapping. And although that's fine, obviously he gets to challenge some board, he's probably going to soak this hero power. But the problem is you're not tapping, so you're not digging to those tools you really need to win the game. And even though he has Backfire next turn or even Weapon, those are turns that you're just taking off against Priest. And a lot of the time, the response from Priest to like 3 mana pass, 3 mana pass, a lot of the time, is just too powerful. It's too much damage.
Is this the most low-key annoying Neophyte you've ever seen in your life, Raven? Like, what's the turn? Like, everything is just ever so slightly frustrating because of Cult Neophyte.
Hero Power Face replay.
But, like, have we achieved anything with that play? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, push the Hero Power to face, played some cards.
But you could have just Hero Powered the Cult Neophyte and attacked face with the minions. And the board stays the same. But you just... Okay, what you have gained this turn for the cost of an entire Raised Dead is that you still have a 0 mana hero power this turn. That's the difference. Was that worth it? I'm not entirely sure.
Me neither. Me neither. I guess, okay, here's what it's achieved. He gets the most cards out of his hand over the course of X amount of turns because he has Coin Voracious Reader, right? So he can dump a lot of cards, because if you Voracious Reader with 2 Raised Deads in hand, well, that's not going to do you any favours.
Agreed. That is an additional upside for sure, and I think that's probably the primary motivation for the play being taken.
It did look silly, though.
Yes, it did. Because, you know, I mean, it's kind of weird to say, because even presenting that argument of, like, he spent 2 mana relatively efficiently that turn, he kind of didn't, because he only spent 1 mana relatively efficiently that turn, because the Raised Deads would have cost 0 on the following turn instead of the 1 that he paid for it. But on the same token, there was no way to spend mana efficiently that turn at all because of how annoying the Neophyte was. So by that argument, you might as well have done the play that he did if your plan is to dump all your cards for Voracious Reader. Once again, Hearthstone is hard. No Soul Rend for Bozzzton. Leta did hold back on 1 Murloc Tiny Fin as well. A couple of reasons for that. Firstly, does reduce the Soul Rend on the other side. It's weird to think about it in that terms, because obviously Soul Rend is a massively overpowered AoE where the cards being burned is supposed to be viewed as a downside, but it just isn't. It's just strictly an upside in the version of the deck that's being played. So Leta is holding back for that. It also gives him Gandling top deck outs over the long run, right? And because it costs 0, he can choose to just go ahead and play it on the Voracious Reader turn if he does want to go for that. The downside now, though, is that he's drawn Void Touched Attendant. So a front-loaded Murloc Tiny Fin on the board is actually a minion that's attacking for 2 on the following turn. So I don't think this decision to hold was as cut and dry as the previous one, but I do still kind of respect it.
And you see him just continue to respect Soul Rend, right? Getting the Benedictus and then just using Hero Power in a couple of minions to trade and not give Bozzzton the big Soul Rend, because that's one of the ways that the Priest can help the Warlock out. If they go super wide into Soul Rend and don't immediately win, the Soul Rend gets Bozzzton to the Bristlebacks, to the Scavengers to be able to then stabilize. So I really like this approach here from Leta. He does have that Void Touched as and when he feels like it can do the most damage. Just got to try and hold on, but this Benedictus is going to get cleaned up. Suddenly the reductions are paying off for him.
More or less the whole hand getting played here for Bozzzton. Both of those heals allow him to proc a Giant here, gets him all the way back up to 24. He can now start again with Rod and Backfire on the following turn. The one thing I perhaps would have liked to have seen come down there is the Rod, if it could have been fit in, perhaps instead of this Neophyte and done something else. Because obviously if you have a Rod equipped at the start of a turn, you then tick once on that Rod, and all you have to do is play Backfire to complete another proc of the Rod, whereas now Bozzzton has to fit in a life tap as well, which I don't think will be a big issue for him. I imagine he kind of wants to do that in this spot anyway, but maybe front-loading the Rod might have been a little bit more beneficial there.
Really expensive mana-wise. The life tap at this point. I think Rod Backfire is probably going to be the start. Could always trade the Viper as well.
Yeah, I think trade Viper over tap might be more likely here. Okay, now there's a coil. So coil tap gets him down to 10 cards, and then the Scavenger interaction will do the thing that it does that it's not supposed to, and then the turn's insane.
Just cost 0 for you viewers out there.
Yes.
It shouldn't, but it does. I believe we can see it. Yep, there we go. Okay, it's maybe a bit delayed on my screen to play the coil. And this is the issue, right? You can get down to 10 so quickly. Bozzzton did a great job of it, honestly, without having to use a Soul Rend. It's just gone fast enough. And you don't win these as the Priest. I think it's fair to say.
And that's the game, indeed, yes. Leta! For the second time! Okay.
He loves it. Look at his face.
Don't you smile. You know exactly what you're doing, and it's working, okay? I will get you banned. I have that power. I absolutely don't, but I will try very hard if you keep murdering Tiny Fins in cold blood, honestly. Disgraceful, man.
If Sol had the power to ban anyone, I would not be here right now. So
true!
Safety net for everyone else out there. Don't you worry. I'll be the first to go. But yeah, strong victory for Bozzzton, because that is a tough matchup. I think Bozzzton did just about enough, right? And it wasn't punished too hard for it. He had enough card draw. That Neophyte, I think, was a big problem there for Leta to deal with in the early game. And Leta just struggled a little bit in that early game, right? Double raised dead in the opening hand when you were only really rocking the lower power levels of the 1-drops or 0 costs. It didn't really pay off for him there. So Bozzzton now going to this game number 3, only needing a win with his Rogue versus Priest, as Sol and I like to agree upon, an extremely close matchup.
As my co-commentator likes to say, 100% free for the Rogue in all circumstances.
Literally lying. Can't believe it. What do you say about being a journalist that's trustworthy and all that rubbish you come out with?
Yeah. Journalistic integrity.
Yeah.
That's not... You said exactly that, did you not?
No. I've never said it's 100%.
Okay, I'll print an official retraction on page 92 in extremely small print later. I do apologize.
I'll take it.
All right, yeah. We're going to see the matchup, though. Again, so let's actually clarify, because we sort of said we're going to argue about this, and then we didn't actually argue about it, which is kind of why we're now down this rabbit hole of just misquoting each other. Like, what is your stance on this matchup in simple
I think it's extremely close.
Okay. I think it's very favoured for Priest.
I think it's close to 50-50.
Okay.
And the stats will back me up on that, I believe.
Like Grandmaster stats or ladder stats? Or what are we looking at? Okay, interesting.
50.7% over 2,000 legend games for the Priest.
Interesting, because also, like, if you're going to weight the ladder stats in either direction, you tend to weight them towards Rogue as well, right? To account for, you know, player skill and agency and mistakes being made, right? So generally, Rogue gains a couple of percentage if played perfectly over the stats that you see on ladder. But yeah, for me, still, this is a disgusting matchup for the Priest. And I think, honestly, this might be something where that's not true, and perhaps player agency and player skill on the Priest side might have something to do for it. Because, for example, was it Psycho on the Priest in the previous series? That play with Mind Render Lucia, and I'm not saying this to call you out, right? Like, you missed that play. Psycho didn't, because Psycho's one of the best players in the world, and it's just trade the Octobot, play the Elucia, play your opponent's entire hand, game over. And like maybe that's a spot that some ladder players are missing as well. So maybe there is a little bit of upside to optimally played Priest in this one as well. But yeah, still for me, very, very good matchup for the Priest overall. But yes, clearly we disagree.
There's not much upside to this hand from Leta though. He does get 1/1s, but that's about it, I imagine. Like, oh, it's a tough choice. He can either start with a trade and see what happens and still go wide if he gets a 1-drop, or he can just wait. The Homunculus procs, he plays 2 0 costs and then a Merchant.
Ding.
Or do that. Is it okay? Erase Elucia from this game just for a second.
Oh please, can we do that? Yes.
Only for a second. You've had it. It's gone.
Okay.
It's back again.
Okay.
But that was a tough call. I think. I think like playing the Merchant on the next turn must have been tempting for Leta.
He wants it, right? Fingers crossed for Leta. And I think this is fingers crossed Tempo and Octobot. Damn it. Damn, my opponent didn't play the best card in their deck on turn 2. Okay. Well, none of these cards play nicely with each other. This is a very frustrating hand right now. Coin is still available, which is always an attractive option for the Mind Render, but again, it's just not really a hand that plays ideally.
Okay, I'm gonna throw one out there. I was gonna
go on
now. Okay, I was wondering whether he played Elucia, right? Then Bozzzton can only play, say, a Voracious Reader because he's not played any minions, so he can't raise dead. Then Leta just has a go at raise dead Elucia again. Not necessarily that next turn he gets it back, but it's in a relatively small pool of minions for raise dead. And when you can double Elucia someone, you're normally having a good time.
Yeah, not the most ridiculous idea. I also looked at just playing the Raise Dead for the Imp, playing the Imp, and then just playing Elucia, and then coining a 1-drop out of your opponent's hand. I think that was also something that was available. And then you're just giving your opponent Voracious Reader, which, of course, you know, they don't play because playing it draws 3 cards for you.
Yep. Yeah, interesting choices, honestly, that turn.
And we'll see here from Bozzzton whether or not he smells a rat on the other side. Whether he smells a witch. How much of this hand is going to get dumped? Because now this is the big choke point. Bozzzton! Okay, coin coming out. Looks like some cards are getting dumped, but Swindle is now being cast as well. This is still playing around Elucia to an extent, because you're taking discounted cards and replacing them with more expensive ones, in theory. Wow, okay.
Double step brain freeze.
Insane.
Look at this.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, very, very nicely navigated from Bozzzton in the end. Love this turn.
Oh, it's one thing I love about certain matchups, and there are actually just a lot of them right now, and I think it's something that's maybe not talked about enough. But we're talking about in-depth turn 3 and 4 plays.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's hard, and I can't even work out some of the plays that are like, oh, maybe this play feels like 3% better than the other option, you know, in some circumstances.
3? An entire 3%,
I'm being generous.
I know, you're dealing in like fractions of a percent
Rounded
most
up
of the
some.
time in these situations, yeah.
But you know what I mean, right? Like, these tiny decisions, even on turn 2, 3, 4, do have huge impacts in the game. And, This is going to be like, yes! Second.
It's back. Yeah, I'd love to get a slice of Bozzzton's mind on that previous turn, though, because you can argue that he just did the generic good turn, right? He played an Octobot, he discounted his Octobot, he drew cards, he drew Plunderers, he played the Plunderers. You know, that all makes sense in terms of just being an anti-aggro deck in the matchup. So it could have just so happened that what he did played around Alucia very effectively as well. But I think it probably was on his mind to some extent, because it hasn't been a smooth opening aggro curve from Leta, right? It's been weird stuff in general, which I think does go to indicate perhaps what this card that's now on the far left of Leta's hand, which Bozzzton will be logging as being stuck in hand for 3 turns now, what that could end up being. And obviously Benedictus gets thrown into that mix, Gandling gets thrown into that mix in some situations, and Mindrender Alucia generally gets thrown in there as well. Having seen the one of Voracious Reader, that gets ruled out, because of course Leta is only playing one of them.
And he saw a Merchant shuffled as well, right? Sometimes that sticks around for late game.
Well, this is exciting. Discount. Mine. Yep, love it.
It's not funny, but it is at the same time.
Since I seem to have the ability to manifest these things, we got the Mr. Blue card reaction reel that I asked for on air from Daruk last season. Maybe we can get the Getting Mindrender Alucia reaction reel.
You could even just take that from Europe. I think we've had enough of it just here, never mind anywhere else.
Job's done. Give me that.
What's happening here? Shadow Step Alucia, play Alucia, there's still a Kobold Geomancer in your hand. You're saying you'd rather your opponent played a Kobold Geomancer this turn than a Colteron.
And give health to the thing to trade.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. Yeah. But like mechanically that's basically the only thing that Shadow Step affects, right? It dumps the Shadow Step and it means his opponent has a Kobold instead of a Colteron this turn, and the decks will double swap at the end of the turn.
Right. And I might be losing it, so be ready to shower me. If he hadn't... Yeah, that's fine, actually. Yeah, okay, never mind. I was just working out, like, he would have... Like, Bozzzton would have had a priest turn, right, this turn, which he doesn't have now. By doing
a priest turn?
Yeah, this turn would...
priest turn.
If he hadn't have gone with all the Alucia shenanigans, if I hadn't have done the double Alucia, Bozzzton would have had, like, a priest draw, right, as opposed to his rogue.
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
True. Yes. But obviously, like, I'm logging that as kind of net neutral for Leta's decision making, right? Like an average one of additional card from Bozzzton's deck versus an average one of additional card from Leta's deck. I think just based on the information that he knew, this is probably a little better. There's, I guess, an argument of who gets the draw step with the bleeds in the deck as well thrown into that, which I guess is a minor impact as well. But yeah, again, rabbit holing a bit. This will double swap. Leta will end up with Colteron Chaplain. Yep.
Okay.
I've cast way too many Control Priest mirrors in my time to get caught out by double Alucia shenanigans, Raven.
This is tough, right? Because Benedictus looks good, but not being able to hero power looks terrible. So although it's tempting to just get the bigger minion knocked down, I do, again, respect the play from Leta. Just keeping the board defended, getting the hero powers in. Next turn, he can Benedictus hero power if nothing else is there. But Bozzzton picks up a secret passage, Sottle, one of the few singular cards that could really dig him out of this situation. And look at Leta's response.
You see the reaction there from Leta as well.
Oh, Shroud. At this point, Bozzzton can play an Og Merchant if he needs to, right?
I think so, yeah. If it's useful enough on board, I would imagine we would see it come down, yeah.
Yeah, so he could do like this, basically, is what I was looking at. Although there's one Shadow Step being used for Bozzzton, right?
You're paying.
But
It was used by Leta.
yeah, by Leta, but from Bozzzton, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is no
Benedictus hero power. Likely to see a start with a trade from the Traveling Merchant next turn from Leta, but Bozzzton now with field contact and options to draw.
Mm-hmm.
Would he ever take a turn off here? So actually in like Neophyte and Swindle first. Is there anything that would make worthwhile?
Quiet.
Is there a Brain Freeze remaining? I suppose that'd be a pretty good pickup just to isolate the Lucia on board, lock out the Benedictus for a turn. There is not. Yeah, hard to imagine what that can do, because you really don't want to take 5 this turn if you can avoid it, right? Because suddenly then the ping clock just becomes a little bit too real overall, I would say.
I guess in a perfect scenario, 1 thief into X, right, is probably the thing, but that's maybe a bit too narrow to pin your hopes on.
Yeah.
Again, you could go prep Secret Passage here, or just take the extra draw from the Penflinger. Could prep Penflinger again. And again, not necessarily to set up some kind of kill, but just to cycle more, give more options next turn.
Yeah.
No hold back though.
Board in the end though. This is a lot of damage going through.
10.
8 being pushed with the Wriggling Horror. I imagine the field contact does need to be taken care of here.
He's going to play
Probably now just Traveling Merchant as a minion, yeah. Big enough to just threaten lethal on the following turn.
Yeah, I mean, he would have already cycled it, right? If that wasn't, if that was the plan.
Absolutely.
Going to ping off, and now this might just be one too many big minions to deal with. Bozzzton, only 8 cards left. Is there anything he can do to stop this from Leta?
1 Thief, Cone of Cold, 1 Thief Flurry is probably the first 2 things your mind go to in this position. You can do something to pick off a couple of the smaller minions. Obviously, you can dagger down the 2-1 if you hit Cone of Cold and then lock out the board. You can dagger down the 2-1 and hope for another way to deal with the 2-3 if you find Flurry. And then in the meantime, you also have to pick up the other field contact and just hope to make something happen with that on the following turn. So I think the best way to fulfill all those conditions is the Shroud.
Oh,
yep,
okay.
Perfect.
Well, that's ticking boxes.
It is. Field contact playable this turn, of course, because it has stealth. It'll just stick to the board. In every situation, first flame.
You could kill the Benedictus.
Sure, it's enough though, is it? Does it have to be evocation for exactly Flurry?
Yeah, no brain freezes left means that even like prep passage or anything wouldn't really cut it.
Oh, he does go first flame, okay. So now prep, first flame, second flame, Org Merchant, the 6-5. As long as he does the Org Merchant last, no disasters here, which means he is now technically alive, which, as we all know, Raven. No, finish it for me.
He's the best kind.
Thank you.
I was just looking if there's well, you set me up for that, I apologize, but I was looking if there's Void Touch attendant.
Hey!
There's one left, and there it is. That's what I was looking for. And Bozzzton, a bit of a grimace there. Takes the loss with the Void Touch off the top, and I believe that's not the first time that's happened today. I believe over in Asia Pacific, was it Surrender who needed it exactly off the top for a lethal to win? I think it was, we'll have to check. But Leta getting the victory there with the Priest. It seems to be lining up pretty well for Subtle's side of this matchup, and well at all for mine, but I don't care. It does mean that, take a look where we're going here. Bozzzton is going to be, of course, queuing his Rogue once again. This is Conquest. We're not doing Last Hero Standing like we did last week. That will be next week, I believe, and then Conquest for this one. So Bozzzton going to be on his final deck of the Rogue. I'm just waiting to see what Leta is going to queue now that after 3 goes, he finally gets the victory on that Priest.
Yes, indeed. Here you see one of the crucial turns, certainly the big discount Mind Render turn. This Shadow Step on the Elucia, I'm kind of still thinking about it as well. Because even after I said we've probably gone down the rabbit hole too deep, I kept thinking of more things. Like, because of the switch that you get to see at the end of the turn, he also got to see what the next card draw was from Bozzzton as well by Shadow Stepping the Elucia. So he knew that one of the cards in hand was Penflinger, which I think then upset him even more when the next card off the top was Secret Passage, and that was his reaction because he knew the contents of the other card,
right.
Which I think is kind of cute. But overall, I think that was probably the game-winning play there for Leta, and we've now seen it twice today, right? One of the additional ways that you can abuse Elucia in this matchup by abusing the Octobot discount on the other side as well. But we're now going to see Leta moving on away from that Priest, as you said, and it looks like he is going to be queuing up his own version of Handlock, which is one unstable Shadow Blast in terms of the one-offs thrown in there. That is supporting the Battlegrounds Battlemaster alongside the two legendaries. Everything else nice and clean. Do you remember when we first switched to Rod builds a couple of weeks ago in Grandmasters and some players were just playing one Rod in their deck? Did that make any sense to anyone? I don't think so.
It did not.
Okay.
The one big thing to look at here is 0 nulls. And that, as you mentioned, the 1 blast, and I guess in general the +1 coil. And most decks drop 1 coil for one of the early cuts you can make and not feel the difference too much there. So
I think
no nulls is the biggest deal for me.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. I think a very common list is, -1 coil, -1 something else for +2 nulls for this list, right? I think that's a very common list that you do see on ladder overall. So Leta is just making room for a little bit of extra removal and a little bit of extra card draw, just tilting his deck a little bit closer to Fatigue Warlock, right? Which I think has been a real problem this season as time's gone on. There isn't like clear divides between the Warlock builds. It's much more of a sliding spectrum as to, which end you are closest to. There's like double Armor Vendor, double Hand of Gul'dan, double Ultra Fire at one end, and then there's a Netheron, double Null, double Flesh Giant at the other end. But in between that, there's 180 different versions of Warlock that are just on a sliding scale between the two.
And even different uses of cards, right, as we enter this game. Unstable Shadow Blast, I think initially was thought of as, Quest Proc, right? And we see that in the Heavy Fatigue list with not only Quest Proc, but also killing your opponent with them after Tamsin. But I think the reason we've seen, for example, 1 come back into this list for Leta is actually just a big removal tool, because it's one of the things you start to miss once you cut them both, is that cheap, like low mana, deal high damage option.
Agree.
So, it's just interesting that even different cards have different uses in these different builds of Warlock. But already diving into this one, I think Leta would be less excited to see an Octobot on 2 as he would be in the past.
And speaking immediately of different usages of cards, this is quite a divergent play from Leta, where I think a lot of the time, with old Handlock, particularly 1 Mortal Coil Handlock, 8 mana Flesh Giant, even 9 mana Flesh Giant Warlock on the coin, what you would have seen there was tap on turn 2, and then you would have seen tap into Tour Guide on turn 3, and that would have opened up various giant curbs. Leta, with his slightly more fatigue-facing list, with the Pantharas with the double coil, just plays the Tour Guide, taps for 0, Mortal Coils it same turn, which has now dug him a couple of extra, or at least 1 card deeper, and he's been rewarded with a Ruined Mithril Rod to be able to play on turn 3 now.
Well, Bozzzton has the double Octo, so feels good about that. Double Shadow Step might be a bit too much, and the worst part is no real way to proc this Swindle that feels good. Do you think he has to just commit this Og Merchant, or Gordon?
I think so. A Swindle needs to be played, right? Like you said, the hand to be discounted right now is just so miserable that Bozzzton needs to change that, right? So he needs to get this Swindle played so he can actually pick up some relevant cards to discount with the Octobot.
And here, because of a lack of backfire, I wouldn't be overly upset at the Rod into coin Mortal Coil, honestly. Get the use while you can.
Is 2 damage worth a coin? Because I think the Gordon will definitely be there next turn, right? So you could just coil it next turn and hold on to your coin, theoretically, which I think I prefer in this spot. Wow, okay. Completely different line in the end from Leta.
Yeah, and sorry I didn't really answer you that quick. I was trying to work out if the ordering or saving of mana or not would change Giants, but obviously if you hold the coin, then it's not a problem. The reduction,
Yeah,
the
okay.
benefit happens either way. So yeah, wouldn't have been too fussed either way, honestly. But Leta just going for those taps, just wants to get to that 10 card or less option, I imagine, a little bit faster than he would if he used 3 mana on the equip.
So many options.
And honestly, although it felt strange to see, with like Backfire's such a great combination with Rod that without it in hand, like I can see tapping instead.
Ugh. That was not the passage he was looking for.
Does he just turn around and use a different secret passage at this point?
Is that how that works? Like, if you're like lost in a cave and you discover a secret passage in a wall, you very rarely get to go, I don't like the look of this one, I'll just use the other one over there. I don't think, you know, secret passages are a very common commodity that are just...
I think if you've got one secret passage built into your, I don't know, scary mansion, you've probably got 2.
Okay. Citation needed, but I will accept it and move on.
Or the secret passage could have a secret passage.
As was the case here, yes. When you open the door to one secret passage, you just find an interwoven web of multiple secret passages that have weird goth people in them that make your spells cost more.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Okay, yeah. That is my experience, yes.
For all the secret passages I've tried, it comes up a lot. It's weird.
I just walk into them and immediately all my magic gets muddled. It's incredible.
That his hand looks a little bit muddled as well. Like, it feels a bit too defensive to go touch tap. Could still go tap Panthera.
Raven designing a Hearthstone Bop It coming soon to door near you.
That would be great, wouldn't it? And I want
it. Tap it.
Concede. That was what I get. Rage quit. Be great. Come on, work on that for me. Choose which Hearthstone voice lines to chuck in. I'm sure they'll be okay with it.
I wonder.
The problem here as well for Bozzzton is that he doesn't even, like, the one option he has of proccing this Octobot isn't one he wants to use, right?
I know, it's so...
Although he has Shadow Steps, I think he still wants this this spell damage like stored up, right? He doesn't, although he could of course just Octo Og Merchant, Shadow Step the Og Merchant to still have it in hand.
Yeah.
It feels like a bit of an overuse. I don't know if you agree, but it feels like a lot used up for not a lot of game.
It does, but at the same time you don't always need all your resources, or you actually very rarely need all your resources in this matchup to actually achieve the kill. And it's whether you can afford to take a whole turn off here. I think maybe you can, because generally I think, as we saw from Frenetic, I think a good signpost in this matchup is that you want to be going off with first field contact by turn 6 to 7 as a bare minimum. So you could maybe have taken this turn off and then look to set up next turn, but you've also got to consider things like Cult Neophyte on the other side, right? And what that means for not only your field contact turns, but your setup turns as well. So I think in the end, Bozzzton just kind of goes halfway houses here and says, I'll commit the Org Merchant to the board, but I'll preserve the Shadow Steps. And I do think that's more flexible, long run, because obviously if he needs to max out on spell damage from here, he can still find the other Org Merchant and just use both Shadow Steps on that, and then still have maximum spell damage of what's still available. But if he does end up needing to Shadow Step a field contact, for example, he still has two Shadow Steps left remaining to be able to do that with. So I like this line in the end from Bozzzton.
Also set up to a relatively slow turn from Leta. Although this was a good turn, he's brought second stage quest. You know, he hasn't tapped. He's still got 16 cards left in the deck, which is a lot, honestly, for around this stage of the game.
Quiet.
Does have that giant nice and cheap, though, so we'll be able to drop that down pretty soon. Prep Spring
Got a big
Water?
cram session.
Ah, okay.
I think Crown Session makes the most sense, yeah, for this kind of exact scenario, right? He really can't afford many whiffs off the top, so I think 0 mana draw a card with Crown Session, which is essentially what it is with the prep, is worthwhile, because he needs to keep this chain going under all circumstances. Oof, this is a rough field contact turn for Bozzzton. I think we might now be in that spot where Shadow Step contact is necessary, but now the resources are starting to just get eaten a little bit. That's 1 Org Merchant, 1 Shadow Step down if another one gets used here.
Not what I want.
It feels too risky not to save this contact though, right?
Agreed.
Like, yes, he has another one, but he has another one in the next 12 cards, and I've seen personally too many bottom 4 contacts for my liking, so although this is a little bit painful for Bozzzton, I do respect the choice. Is the safe option here.
And he does still have the X+2 breakpoint available. He has 1 spell damage minion, 1 Shadow Step left remaining, which is +2 spell damage, which is 8 times 4 in total for 32, which is plenty for dealing with Warlock. So he's now he's walking the tightrope at this point, right? These are all the resources that he's really allowed to use unless he can get bailed out by a One Thief or a Kazakas. He has to preserve basically everything else to have full security of winning the game.
I was like to thinking about here, like coin drained soul, I guess. Because surely he wants
Coin Panther.
doesn't want the giant. Okay. I'll be honest, Leta taking this a lot slower than I personally would, but you know, he's the pro, not me. I'd just be scared not to play a big threat this turn. I feel like he's handing Bozzzton a full turn to do whatever, but maybe the idea that he has the Shadow Step field contact means that the threat can be answered regardless.
Yeah, I do agree, but I also think, first off, Leta has been laser focused on card draw this entire game. I think he's recognizing that that is probably his win condition overall, is getting down to 10 cards as quickly as possible and just making the massively oppressive board. That's kind of what we've seen win for Warlock in general. And secondly, as you say, like 1 threat at a time, doesn't really feel like it gets there against the what Bozzzton set up on the other side.
2015, 1
I know, it really
time.
is. Imagine. 4 mana, 7/7. Yikes.
And overload.
Well, there is the first backfire of proceedings. Going to weave in the tap first to get everything nice and cheap. Can now get some cards out of his hand to then cycle backfire down to sub 10 cards. And then again, because of the interaction, as we mentioned previously. Yeah.
Well, this is just a lethal setup realistically, isn't it? He can play Giant Double Scavenger and he has Battlegrounds Battlemaster in hand. And if basically 2 out of the 3 of these live this turn, he's good.
Indeed. That is field contact off the top, though. We, as commentators, have had to talk about Leta's turn, but I would hope that Bozzzton was largely ignoring everything that Leta was doing and calculating his field contact out off the top here. So it looks like he was doing that because he has gone off immediately with the field contact. That's +1 spell damage. Now that's +2 spell damage, which is the breakpoint I was talking about. And as long as he can get through these last 5 cards, he should be chilling here. And 0 on Shroud, still has to spend 2 on Garrots, right? Has 2 mana remaining. Penflinger still in deck. Yeah, he's chilling.
Looks fine, doesn't it?
He is chilling.
And as you pointed out, I imagine Bozzzton was working out what's going on with this turn during Leta's turn himself. Mainly because he knew what cards he had left in the deck, of course, and none of them were problems, right? There was no draw that caused him an issue, because he'd already got through Shrouds, for example. The Garrots are cheap enough to whip in as well.
Oxy Swindle will draw 3 cards, including a spell, at least 1, which I believe thins out the remainder of his deck and makes this guaranteed, if not extremely high percentage from this point. There we go. Nice and easy.
Yeah, really good win there for Bozzzton. Getting it versus the Rogue, versus Leta's Warlock means he is going to make it out of Group C. And again, a big win for him. I mentioned at the start of the series, not the overall, the top performance we have or have had in Grandmasters, but he's still here, he still hangs on, and this is a good start to the week for him there, just being able to get a victory there, make it to top 8, and we could potentially see him cash in on a good amount of points overall. But any big highlights for you out of this specific game, Sottle?
I think just pretty well navigated series from Bozzzton overall. Very well navigated game individually, I will say. One of the better games of Garrote Rogue that we have seen in quite some time. I gave Bozzzton a hard time last week, and I think rightly so, because he played badly, but I will do the exact opposite here and say that was a very, very good performance from Bozzzton, and I think he's kind of growing into this season now at just about the right time, as we were talking about at the start. The big question for Leta, though, from his side was whether he was right to be so hyper-focused on drawing cards, because I think that's what he was, right? We saw it turn 2, life tap first, tour guide first, then life tap for 0, mortal core your own tour guide, which draws an extra card on that turn. Then on turn 3, didn't play a rod, tapped instead, which draws an extra card on that turn. So I think he was incredibly focused on getting down to 10 cards as quickly as possible. We didn't see the fruits of that labor because he just didn't hit a backfire in the top half, essentially, so he still got down to 10 cards quite slowly in